In this video, we're going to discuss something called Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, also known as UEFI. A computer is a physical machine. It's an actual thing that you can touch. I've got one sitting here underneath my desk recording the audio for this video, and inside this physical machine there are all kinds of physical components, such as a microprocessor, the CPU that performs all of the general computation, a graphics processor, that is a processor that deals with the graphics being rendered on the screen. It contains storage devices that can store data. It contains random access memory, which is the short-term memory of the computer. A computer is basically a box full of all kinds of different hardware components. The point is, all of this hardware needs to be told what to do. A processor isn't going to process anything if you don't give it anything to process. And this is where software comes in. So software is not a real thing. It's not anything you can touch. Software is code. Code that can be executed by the hardware in the computer. It's code that tells the hardware what to do. And of course that software is the operating system of the computer and the programs running in it. But now here's the problem. Let's say we have a computer that is turned off, and there is some operating system on a hard drive in that computer. So this could be Mac OS, Windows, some Linux operating system. That doesn't really matter. There is an operating system on a hard drive in that machine, and we press the power button. Now there is a problem. The operating system tells the hardware what to do, but the operating system is on a hard drive that is turned off. So how is it going to tell the hardware to turn on that hard drive and access the operating system? It's kind of a paradox going on here. We have a problem. So the question is, what's going to tell the hardware of the computer to initialize that disk and run the operating system? Well, we need kind of a small mini operating system that will tell the hardware to do this, and that's what's called the BIOS of the computer, the basic input-output system. The BIOS is a very small operating system, a very small piece of software that is installed on a microchip that is installed on the motherboard of the computer. So when you press the power button on a computer, all of the hard drives are turned off, all of the storage devices are turned off. The only software that's available to the hardware is this BIOS, this tiny piece of code on a tiny chip on the motherboard. That piece of code will then be run by the hardware. The BIOS also has some memory to store its settings. So like any other real operating system, the BIOS also has a bunch of settings, and those settings are stored in a memory that is usually called the CMOS memory. So the first thing the BIOS will do when you press the power button of the computer is the BIOS runs. The BIOS reads the settings from its CMOS memory. So the BIOS obtains the settings from that memory, the settings for the hardware components of the computer. So these can be settings like what speed should the processor be running at, which hard drives should be turned on in which order, stuff like that. So that's the first thing it does, obtain the settings. Then it will run the power on self-test or post. This means initializing all of the hardware components of the computer one by one and checking if they work properly. And if that is the case, if all of the hardware works, or all of the important hardware that is required to boot up the computer works, then it'll show what's called a post screen. So that is usually just a screen with the logo of the motherboard manufacturer on it. That's the post or power on self-test screen, and it tells you that the most important components are all working. Then the BIOS will find the operating system, the real operating system of the computer, on one of the storage devices, and it will then run that operating system. And from that point on, the operating system takes over from the BIOS, and then the computer can boot up. So the BIOS is like a mini operating system that is used to initialize the hardware, to to start the boot process. We just talked about these BIOS settings, by the way, that are stored in this CMOS memory. Those settings can actually be changed by the user of the computer. So when you see the post screen appear, and most people familiar with building computers and such will know this, you're able to press a certain key on the keyboard, and most of the time it's delete or F2, some weird key like that. And when you press that key, you'll go into a settings menu where you can change the CMOS settings of the BIOS. BIOS stands for Basic Input-Output System, and basic it is. Perhaps it's even a little too basic for modern-day computers. So, first of all, a BIOS can only address 1 megabyte of memory, which means it's an extremely tiny piece of code, so basic that it lacks important features that you might want to use with modern-day hardware. Also, it's very, very slow, and it can only initialize one hardware component at a time, which means in large systems with lots of hardware in them, those can take a lot of time to boot if they use a normal BIOS. Finally, because it's so basic, it also has the most basic user interface, which means it's kind of a pain to navigate through and hard to find the settings that you might want to change. So that's why a new system has been introduced, and it's called, you guessed it, Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, or UEFI. And what this is it's a new system that replaces the BIOS that we used to use. The UEFI is a much more elaborate piece of software than the BIOS. So first of all, it can be 32-bit or 64-bit like a regular operating system, which means it can address way more memory. And what this means is that it can support features that BIOSes won't ever be able to support. These features include networking capabilities and also being able to boot drive partitions that are larger than 2 TB. It can load devices much faster, making the computer boot much faster. And it also has this nicer user interface, which is easier to navigate through, and you can use a mouse now. With BIOS, you could only use the keyboard of the computer. And that's basically what UEFI is. It's a much more elaborate version of what used to be BIOS that can do a lot more things, can do things much faster, and has a much, much better user interface, which is why all computers use it these days. Even though some computers still have a boring settings menu that looks like an old BIOS screen. So the thing is with UEFI, even though it can use these slick-looking graphics where the mouse can be used, it doesn't necessarily have to do that. On some computers, the settings screen still looks like an old BIOS settings screen. So the screen doesn't necessarily tell you whether it's a UEFI or a BIOS computer. Anyway, I hope this video informed you a bit more about what UEFI is and why we use it in modern day computers. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and of course, thank you for watching.